On after Laura Kuenssberg.
Hello. Sometimes you see conflict in Gaza, in Ukraine. It feels like there's war everywhere. It can feel overwhelming. So today we'll be asking, where might it all end? Every day our screens show new images of conflict. Ordinary people's lives turned upside down. It can feel the world's more chaotic every minute. This week, 3 British aid workers killed in Gaza add to the toll.
Humanitarians and civilians should never be paying the consequences of war.
As war rages in the Middle East, the British government faces demands from across the spectrum to stop arms sales to Israel.
If it is the case that international law has been contravened, then it's absolutely right that offensive arms are suspended to Israel.
And strikes take even more lives in Ukraine. This latest attack from Russian missiles made in Iran. The defence alliance NATO touting this week for more pounds, euros and dollars to help repel Russia.
It is vital for us that Ukraine wins and Putin loses.
So with a dangerous diplomatic jigsaw, we have one big question this morning. How can we deal with the rising threats to our world? With us this morning, the Prime Minister's right-hand man, Oliver Dowden. We're joined too by the politician who wants to be the next Foreign Secretary, Labour's David Lammy. And the Chief of the Defence Alliance, NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, tells us about the growing threats to the West.
We live in a more dangerous world and we had to be prepared for crisis.
Morning. Today we are reflecting on 2 important anniversaries. It's 6 months since the 7th of October Hamas attacks on Israel. But it's also 75 years since the founding of the defence partnership NATO. We are living in serious times, but I promise we will have lots of enlightening conversations too this morning, and maybe even a bit of wit with our panel today. We're joined by Ruby Wax. We're joined by Lord Mark Sedwill, who was the National Security Advisor and Cabinet Secretary in charge of the Civil Service, and also by Baroness Amos, a former Labour Cabinet Minister under Tony Blair, but now Master of University College, Oxford. A very warm welcome to all 3 of you, and a very warm welcome to you, of course, at home. Let's start, as we always do, by checking today's headlines. The Sunday Times and The Observer both lead on David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, who says that the UK's backing for Israel is not unconditional. He's warning of potential famine in Gaza, and a Royal Navy ship is being sent with aid. The Sunday Telegraph has former defence ministers saying that the UK has failed to prepare itself for potential war. While the Sunday Mirror has something different. It says there's unease at the Rovers' return, revealing that the cost of living crisis is hitting the number of Corrie stars, which could be cut to save cash. And the BBC has lots of coverage of Storm Kathleen. Look at these pictures from Northern Ireland. The storm has brought both strong winds and the warmest day of the year so far. Dozens of flights have already been cancelled, so please be safe out there. Well, we're going to talk a lot about security, our security, and what's going on around the world. Mark, you spent years working in this field. It does feel, as a citizen, everywhere you look, it looks really bad.
Yeah, I think we're in the most dangerous period since the end of the Cold War. And I think what people are finding overwhelming is not just that, but the sheer complexity of the international environment. We have the war in Ukraine, the crisis in Gaza, much less reported conflicts all across sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel, tensions elsewhere, risks around Taiwan, other issues in the Middle East. And probably the biggest dilemma in many ways facing the international community today is to handle all of that, to deal with climate change, to regulate AI, to deal with all of these other issues that we're facing. We need the international community to be able to cooperate, and yet we're at a time of the most acute geopolitical tensions.
So our leaders are finding it very, very difficult with all of those huge crises. I mean, Valerie, you were the UN humanitarian chief, as well as having been a Labour cabinet minister in 2014, when there was another crisis in Gaza. David Cameron this morning is warning of mass starvation. There's a Royal Navy ship on the way. I mean, when you look at this situation, do you think our leaders are anywhere near grappling with it?
I think that's one of the major challenges that we face. I completely agree with Mark about the challenges that are facing us and the complexity of it. I do think that the kind of global leadership that we are seeing right now doesn't really feel as if it's up to tackling those crises, partly because there are so many differences between the countries that are members of the UN Security Council, for example. Mm-hmm. But it's also about sheer scale. I mean, 2024 is very different to 2014. And if you look at the Middle East, for example, what we saw then when we had a crisis in Gaza was nothing. I mean, of course, it was appalling at the time, but in sheer numbers terms and the length of time that it lasted, nothing compared to what we're dealing with now.
That's really interesting. Both of you then thinking the scale of the challenges now dwarf what's happened previously. I mean, Ruby, as a citizen, right, maybe like a lot of us watching this, watching the images on the news, watching it day after day, what goes through your mind? Do you find it overwhelming?
I think a lot of people find it overwhelming. I'm surprised that your answers, but that's the job, are so calm. I mean, you're right, we've never come this close. And the images on television, when I was growing up, you just get the news and that's it. But I think the flashing horror constantly and the close-ups, they're doing it intentionally so that we're riled up into this state of being frazzled. And once we're in this fight and flight state, we can't think clearly anymore. So suddenly we hear this and we're not even listening. It's just ignited. And if you come from that background or your relatives didn't quite survive, it's too powerful, it's too overwhelming, and so we're not thinking. I think we can think clear about the Ukraine unless the family's there. It depends how far away the threat is, but this close to, so many Jews are. It's too ignitive. It's so ignitive that I won't even talk about it because I'm terrified of somebody saying the whole thing is an atrocity. Which side do you want me to be on?
And that is a challenge also for our leaders, isn't it? I mean, they're trying to balance all these different competing agendas. Valerie, you want to come in there?
I really wanted to come in on Ruby's point because even for somebody like me who has worked in this, it's incredibly frustrating and it makes me angry because it's about what can you do? And you sit and you watch, day after day, people being killed. We know that the hostages are still there in, the most unimaginable conditions. And you think to yourself, what can you do to make a difference? And there's nothing to grasp onto. And it just goes on and on and on. We're now on the brink of, famine in Gaza. How did we get here is the question that keeps going through my mind.
But Mark, just briefly before we talk to our politicians, are our politicians powerless? Or do we have to actually say, no, they're not, there are things we can do? Because it is easy, isn't it, to just feel despair and then say, oh, maybe there isn't anything we can do.
I think you saw in a couple of the clips at the top of the programme, David Cameron, but also we know from Washington, the acute frustration Western leaders feel at wrestling with all of this. They are really struggling, given the closeness of the relationship with Israel, given the scale of the issue there, to make an impact, to try to navigate a way through this. Israel essentially has three tasks in this campaign. One is, of course, to ensure that Hamas can never carry out an attack of this kind again. Any government would have to do that in any country after an attack, an atrocity of that scale. They have to try and get the hostages out, and they have to try and do that without worsening this humanitarian catastrophe. And they're failing on all three fronts. And I think the frustration in Western capitals is how to try to navigate all of that, and I think that's what we're seeing.
That's what I want to know. There was a Kissinger once who really knew how to navigate and negotiate. I know David Cameron's doing something and he's turning pages, but who's doing the negotiations and who's going to run Israel? What's our ideal? I don't know what the point is, except tearing your hair out because the news is showing you more close-ups.
Okay, well, let's talk to some of the politicians who we do have tried to grapple with it, but that's an interesting point, and Valerie also was suggesting the quality of leadership we have right now perhaps isn't up to the challenge, but let's talk to some of them now. Remember, later we're going to talk about what's happening in Ukraine, but we are beginning this morning with the dreadful events in Gaza. Yesterday, the Israeli military recovered the body of Elad Katzir, one of the hostages who was snatched by Hamas 6 months ago. More than 1,000 people were killed in those attacks, and there are still more than 100 hostages unaccounted for. Since then, Hamas, which our government says is a terror group, they say that 33,000 people have been killed in Gaza. Terrible images day after day we're seeing on our TV screens. But the UK and the US says Israel does have the right to defend itself, yet there's been increasing alarms at its tactics. And the deaths last week of 7 aid workers, including 3 Brits in Israeli airstrikes, does seem to have changed the dynamics. With President Biden warning Israel it must do more to address the suffering of civilians or lose support. And here at home, the attack has upped pressure on the UK government to reveal more about its legal advice on how Israel is waging this war. And there's pressure too from some quarters to stop selling arms to the country. The Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, joins us here this morning. It's always good to have you with us. Welcome to you. Let's start with the legal questions. Under international law, aid workers must be protected. The United Nations says that almost 200 have been killed in Gaza. Do you think Israel's acting within the law in that regard?
Well, as you'll appreciate, Laura, I'm not going to preempt, or indeed it's the case that the government is not publishing legal advice in respect of international humanitarian law. I think the starting point, though, for all of this, and you said at the top of this, and I think it's quite easy to forget, 6 months ago, Israel was subject to the most appalling attack. We know all the details of that, but Israel is still facing this existential threat from Hamas. It's a nation in trauma, and it is prosecuting a legitimate war of self-defence. Now, of course, in the conduct of that war, we are holding Israel to very high standards. Higher standards, of course, than we would have of the terrorist organisation Hamas. Now, in the context of that, we're engaging with Israel on a number of issues. First of all, this point about deconflicting, to make sure that they are not targeting aid workers, and they've got a process for doing that. And we've had robust conversations. The Prime Minister had conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Foreign Secretary Cameron had those conversations. Secondly, we of course need to get more aid into Gaza to alleviate the humanitarian suffering. The people of Gaza have suffered under Hamas. They're now suffering as a result of that. And you've seen today the announcements that we've made in terms of opening that aid corridor. So we're engaging across a wide range of issues with Israel in the context of a country that is fighting to defend itself in its biggest challenge since its foundation.
And that is the important context, and we've made those points already. But on this very important question, do you believe that Israel is acting within the law?
Well, I think that Israel is conducting a legitimate campaign, and it is doing so in a very, very difficult environment where it is facing Hamas, a terrorist organisation that hides amongst its civilian population. Now, in terms of the United Kingdom government's assessment of that, the way that we undertake this, and indeed we are required by law to periodically review compliance with arms export controls, and that happens to all nations. Now, the way we do that is for the Foreign Secretary to take advice. He then advises the Business Secretary about whether we should be able to continue those arms exports. Now, the Foreign Secretary's advice in respect of that has not changed.
So currently, you believe Israel is acting within the law. You say the advice has not changed. So currently it is your belief Israel is acting within international law.
The position of the government is that we don't publish
That's
our
not my
legal...
question. You don't have to publish
Laura,
the legal
point
advice.
One essentially gets to that point. The key thing is it legitimate? Can we lawfully sell arms to Israel? And yes, that is the case, and that is the basis. On that basis, the Foreign Secretary has given advice to the Business Secretary, and our position hasn't changed.
So that's very important.
Now,
as things stand, so I just want to emphasise this for our viewers, because whether or not you publish the legal advice is a row about the process. Whether you believe right now Israel is acting within the law is a question of principle. You have said yes, as things stand, you believe Israel is acting within the law. Except that I want to ask you this question, because the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee...
I just think we need to be absolutely clear about this. So Israel is has legitimately able to receive arms exports for us. Our advice hasn't changed. Of course, we have concerns about the way in which Israel is conducting itself. That is why we have raised issues, for example, in relation to aid and getting more aid in. That's why we've raised issues in relation to deconflicting. But that is in the context of a legitimate conflict that Israel is pursuing.
So Alicia Cairns, who's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, prominent Conservative and your MP in your own party, she said more than 3 weeks ago that the government had received advice which said Israel had broken international humanitarian law, but the government hasn't announced it. Is that true?
Well, first of all, now I know I'm going to sound pedantic over this, but it is important that we're not publishing the legal advice. That's a precedent that we've followed from previous governments. So I'm cautious about getting into individual details. It is the case that we have concerns that we have raised with Israel. And remember, there's multifaceted areas of this. So there's areas about the way in which they're conducting the campaign. There's areas about the way in which aid is delivered.
But I'm asking
ultimately,
you a clear
that
question
is
here.
something that then feeds through from the Foreign Secretary as to
But I'm asking
can we legitimately export arms, and
but
that
I'm
remains
asking you
the
a
case.
clear question here. I'm not asking you whether or not you're going to publish the legal advice. We know you're not going to publish the legal advice. That is a long-standing convention. I'm asking you if it is true that the government's legal advice that they have received says that Israel has broken international humanitarian law.
No, we have specific concerns about different areas of Israel's conduct. We are raising those concerns with Israel. By the way, it's so important to remember this. We've gone from the horrors of 6 months ago to holding Israel to extraordinary high standards. It's right that we do so, and it's right that we raise these concerns where we say, look, what you're doing in respect of not getting aid in, or what you're doing in respect of your targeting, raises concerns for us, and we need you to engage. And by the way, Israel has engaged with those issues. We've got two crossings now opened. We want to get the aid to continue to flow through there. We are getting progress in terms of understanding what happened with that horrific attack. And for example, we've seen 2 officers suspended. But I think this kind of the kind of relish with which people are rushing towards this question without understanding the broader context. It's right to raise individual issues, but you have to see it in this wider context of the challenge that Israel faces.
It's interesting you say that. You've said twice, actually, that Israel is being held to extremely high standards. And you've just said you think some people are relishing sort of putting Israel on the spot over whether or not they're acting legally. Who do you think's relishing that? Don't you think people are just asking questions based on what they see as appalling suffering in Gaza? Who do you think is relishing it?
Well, I think this is an important point, which is that I think it's all too easy for the world to forget the horrors that Israel faced and rush back to attacking Israel and holding Israel to standards that we wouldn't remotely hold other countries to. Now, it's right that we hold Israel to those highest standards. No, because Israel is a democratic country. It's a rules-based country. It's a part of our broader Western family of nations. We should expect the highest standards of it. What I would say is that in response to legitimate concerns, and I'm not pulling punches about my concerns about the way in which Israel has conducted some of this conflict, they have responded to that. That's the way in which I think the United Kingdom government should use its relationship to address broader concerns, not least the humanitarian suffering that we're seeing in Gaza.
And has Israel responded enough? I mean, it's interesting, your colleague David Cameron has said very clearly this morning the UK's support is not unconditional. President Biden's attitude also has shifted somewhat in recent weeks. Have they responded enough?
Well, there's welcome initial steps. So, for example, it's very, very welcome the fact that they've opened up these new crossings. I think what we'd like to have is the reassurance that the aid continues to flow through those crossings. It's not just enough to open them, the aid's got to flow through. We've had initial assurances about the way in which they're deconflicting. We want to see that turn into practice. And I think that's the kind of mature relationship that we can have with Israel in the context of this conflict.
And in the context of this conflict, I just would like to ask a very specific question to get this on the record. If the UK government receives legal advice that says Israel is in breach of the international law, will arms sales stop?
We will, of course, act in accordance with our obligations under law in respect of arms sales. And the way that works is there's legal advice, the Foreign Secretary reaches a judgment and he gives that advice to the Business Secretary. If it is the case that we can't lawfully, in accordance with the Act, do so, then of course we won't supply those arms. But that's precisely the position, for example, even in respect to the United States or any other country around the world. We rightly hold ourselves to a high standard, and we hold the countries to whom we export arms to a high standard. And I think that's what you'd expect. And it contrasts so strongly our adherence to very high values with the appalling atrocities that are being committed by terrorist organisations against Israel. Now, Israel isn't perfect, long way from it, but this is a difficult conflict and we're holding Israel to high standards.
It is also a conflict that's just one of many around the world. And two of your former colleagues, in fact, the recent former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, and a very recently resigned Defence Minister, James Heappey, have both said in hard terms this morning in one of the newspapers that the UK is not prepared enough to deal with the challenges and potential conflicts that we face. Are they wrong?
Yes, I think they're wrong. They're absolutely right. And indeed, I think some of your panellists, including Mark Sedwill, made this point before. We're in a more hostile situation than we've been certainly since the end of the Cold War, possibly even before that. And we're seeing threats rise across a range of vectors, not just conventional armed forces, but cybersecurity, and indeed there have been recent incidents in respect of that. Economic security, where the Prime Minister has established an Economic Security Committee of the National Security Council, which I chair. We are taking action across the board. We've set up the National Cybersecurity Centre in respect of cyber. I now take decisions, dozens of decisions daily about investment to protect our economic security. This world is going to get more dangerous as time goes on. We see a combination of hostile states, not least Russia, Iran, North Korea and China. We need to be taking action across those areas. Of course, there's always more to do, but I believe we are making good progress against rising threats.
And it's interesting you link those countries together. We'll hear more a bit later in the programme on that chain of danger, if you like, from the NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg. Just before we close, I want to raise something different with you and important. Our viewers might remember you were with us in November. The morning, the Mail on Sunday published a story about a rape allegation against a Conservative MP being covered up. Now, you said you didn't recognise the notion of a cover-up taking place while you were chair of the party. A report in The Guardian in February, though, suggested that you had been aware of the allegations, but a source close to you denied it. Now, I've seen evidence that suggests you and two former party chairmen did know about the allegations. Did you know?
No, and I would challenge anyone that's saying that to make that public.
So you are adamant you didn't know anything about those allegations?
I answered it fully at the time. I've always been clear that any allegations of rape or sexual misconduct should be investigated by the police. That isn't. We have absolute zero tolerance for that.
But at the time, you said you didn't recognise the notion of a cover-up. But I'm asking you a different question today. You're saying you had no knowledge of any of those allegations.
I've said that repeatedly, and I would challenge anyone that says that that is the case to bring forward the evidence of that.
OK, Oliver Dowden, thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning. It's always great to have you in the studio with us. Thank you very much indeed for your time. The Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, there. Now, on these big issues of security around the world, lots of you have been getting in touch about arms sales from the UK to Israel. Peter has told us arms to Israel must continue. If we stopped giving arms to Israel, it would send a message to all terrorists that democratic countries are ready to capitulate. One of you, though, Rodney, has got in touch to disagree. He says destroying homes and hospitals and not allowing aid support in just confirms Netanyahu's intentions. The UK and the US should stop giving all arms to Israel. David, though, says no amount of finger-wagging is going to work without a cessation in the supply of weaponry. Any words from the UN or other international courts are completely toothless. But there's a lively debate about this already. Glyn thinks, OK, stop arms to Israel. The consequence, all radical Islamist armed groups would have a field day. So a flavour there of your views and the divisions on this subject. Well, Labour's David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, is with us now in the studio. Thank you very much for coming in this morning. On this very fraught issue, there are pretty different views in the Labour Party. So the leader of Scottish Labour, Anas Sarwar, and the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, both now say the government should immediately halt sales of arms to Israel. Are they wrong?
6 months since October the 7th, I've got to begin just by recognising the hostages that are still in Gaza. Many people on the streets of Israel last night protesting that they're still there, and the fact that Hamas still have them. And of course, Elad Katzir, who we now know has died. It's also the case that, quite understandably, issues of proportionality in terms of the rules of war are important. Issues of taking the appropriate precautions are important, and also distinguishing between combatants and civilians. And for those reasons, I do have very real concerns that our obligations in relation to international humanitarian law and the clear risk that our export and licensing regime requires government lawyers to assess and then ministers to act as a consequence might have been breached. And for those reasons, I'm being very, very clear. Publish the advice. The government says they can't publish the advice. They published the advice for bombing the Hutus because of the Red Sea just a few weeks ago. They published the advice in 2011. You can publish a summary of that advice. But if you're not going to publish the advice, at least come to the House of Commons and take questions, which is what David Cameron should be doing.
Well, the House of Commons has been in recess, so that wouldn't have been the case in the last couple of weeks. But on the issue, however, and we'll come to legal advice in a second, some of your colleagues say arms sales should be stopped now. They basically believe, as did many lawyers and academics and many viewers watching the programme, they think we've seen enough. You don't need to wait for the legal advice. Why are people like Sadiq Khan and Anas Sarwar wrong?
Because they are concerned like us, like I am. They have very real doubts. The former head of MI6 has very real doubts. 4 of our Supreme Court judges have very real doubts. They look at the scenes, 33,000 people dead, many of them women and children. Of course they've got concerns about proportionality, but the only person that can answer that is David Cameron, because he's the only person that's received advice. Apparently, he said he was about to receive advice at the beginning of March. It's weeks later. He was dodging questions from journalists this week. Come to the bar of the House of Commons where we return, answer those questions, but publish a summary of advice, because this is hugely important that the United Kingdom is not complicit at all in a breach of humanitarian international law.
But we just heard there Oliver Dowden say that the advice had not changed. So if Oliver Dowden says the advice had not changed, isn't that good enough for you?
Well, look, I remain concerned until I have seen that advice. And I say that not just as a member of the opposition or a Labour MP, but because I don't want to be complicit in any loss of life, and because I value, the Labour Party, surely we must all value life equally on whichever side of this awful conflict it is.
But you clearly are saying then you want to see the legal advice in order to make that decision, even though, you're a lawyer yourself. You want to be the Foreign Secretary in a matter of months. You hope so. Some of our viewers might think, well, you could come to your own conclusion, but you've made it clear you want to wait for that, to see that advice. If Labour wins the election, as a point of principle, would it always publish legal advice on contentious issues if asked to do so?
Look, I do think on issues of war, actually a summary of that advice.
Well, that's a different thing.
Important.
A summary of legal advice is not the same as saying publish the full advice. Which is
I've said, as the government did just a few weeks ago, when British troops were involved in bombing the Houthis because of their actions in the Red Sea, they published a summary of that advice. I remember in the Commons, previous conflicts in Libya, previous conflicts in Syria, again, many parliamentarians were briefed on Privy Council terms as a result of that legal advice.
Hang on, David Lammy, I want to be really clear.
And of course we in government would act as we're saying in opposition.
Well, so a Labour government would always publish legal advice on issues of war?
I've said in the circumstances, I can't foresee every circumstance over the next decade or so. But what I'm saying is, I do believe on this issue where there's so much public discussion and the debate, and quite rightly, British citizens are asking, I hope we're not complicit in that, you should publish a summary of that advice.
But a publish of the summary, not the full legal advice. And forgive me if it might sound to people like I'm dancing on a head of a pin, but this is a very important difference here. If the government says our lawyer's advice will be published in full, that is a completely different thing to saying, yes, here is a summary of the advice that we have that helps us make our case.
I haven't got the advice. I do recognise that there may be circumstances where not all of that advice could be published. There will be things of sensitivity in relation to how we obtain that advice. There may be commercial sensitivity, but a summary of the advice that pertains to Rules 2C on exports and licensing, I think can be published and should be published.
And the Labour government would do.
David Cameron should come to the bar of the House of Commons and answer questions. The Procedure Committee of the House of Commons asked him to do so. He's not done so. And this is why, in serious times like we've got a war in Ukraine, we've got a war in the Middle East, you should not have, frankly, a Foreign Secretary that's in the House of Lords and is not able to receive questions from members of Parliament.
OK, but I want to ask you something else. Back in the day, the Labour government in the early 2000s found itself in a similar position here, under enormous pressure to publish its legal advice over the Iraq war. And they refused for a long time. You yourself, as a young MP, voted against the legal advice being published. Isn't that a double standard that you're now trying to get the Conservatives to do it?
You said as a young MP. I'm not so young anymore. It's 24 years later.
But this is an important point.
It's 24 years later. And one learns from that experience. And let me just say this.
So what, Labour was wrong in 2004 to say no?
Laura, let me say this. Margaret Thatcher suspended sales of arms to Israel. Tony Blair suspended sales of arms to Israel. Gordon Brown suspended sales of arms to Israel, all during previous conflicts. This has been done before. This is a very serious issue. It's now gone on for 6 months. On issues of proportionality, on precaution and distinction, there are real concerns, not just from judges, from the intelligence community, but the broader public. For that reason, let us be sure that we are not in breach of international humanitarian law.
But the war in Iraq was also an extremely serious situation about which many of our viewers and many members of the public at the time had hugely strong views. And at the time, you voted against legal advice being published when Labour was in government. Isn't that a double standard that you're now calling on the Conservatives to do it when it suits you?
No. You're asking me about something that happened over 20 years ago. I'm sitting here drawing on that experience. I'm reflecting on 6 months on from a conflict in which 33,000 people have lost their lives. It's the now that matters. It's the now that matters. And for all of those reasons, publish that advice, but at least come to the bar of the House of Commons and take questions from elected members of Parliament about issues that their constituents feel very strongly about.
OK, we've been talking about transparency and legal advice. The newspapers this morning have new allegations about your colleague, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, and the sale of her home some years ago and whether the proper tax was paid. Now, this has been rumbling around for a while. She has refused to publish the advice she said that she was given that says she did nothing wrong. Why doesn't she just publish it if she's so sure she did nothing wrong and just clear this all up?
But there's nothing new in this story this morning.
Well, why not just publish it so she could move on?
Let me make the point. Angela Rayner has a blended family, effectively like millions of Britons. She did spend time in her husband's home and they would have balanced childcare across 2 homes. That's perfectly understandable. She took the appropriate accountancy advice. She took the appropriate legal advice. She's not broken any rules, not broken any laws. This is a non-story. Why is the story up in the news? Because we have the May elections very shortly. We want to avoid talking about the fact that we have the highest tax burden in this country, that people are £870 worse off as a result of this Tory chaos. That's why we're talking about Angela Rayner. She has a blended family, like lots and lots of people. who balance childcare arrangements across different places.
Some of your critics might say that people are talking about it because she won't just publish the full advice, and then if there's nothing there to see, then she could move on.
We haven't got any kind of constitutional convention I'm aware of, other than for prime ministers and leaders of the opposition, where they publish their tax affairs. That's the situation we've got. Why do we land on this northern woman who had an arrangement with her husband, a blended family? Why do we focus on her and say that she should be the exception? She shouldn't be the exception. She hasn't broken any rules. This is because of the May elections and the Tories not wanting to concentrate on their actions, on rising inflation, of cost of living, on rising utility bills. Those are the issues that we should be focused on, and those are the issues that they want us to obscure.
OK, David Lammy, thank you very much for coming in. It's always great to have you with us in the studio. Well, what did you think of what our politicians have to say? You know we read your emails. We've heard some of them already this morning. You can keep them coming in, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media inclined, you can follow what's going on X or on Instagram. And as lots of you have been doing, you can sign up to our newish newsletter at bbc.co.uk/Laura K newsletter. Now, in a quick reminder, in a few minutes we'll hear from the boss of NATO, the Defence Allowance, and we will talk about Ukraine in some detail. But first, let's go to our panel and their views on what we heard this morning from our politicians. Valerie, as someone who's sat in that chair as a serving frontbencher, the cabinet minister, what did you make of what Oliver Dowden and David Lammy both had to say?
So I want to come back on 2 points that Oliver Dowden made. One in relation to the publication of legal advice. The public want to see the legal advice because they've lost trust and confidence in the government and what the government is saying. And we've seen that in the past. And of course you want to keep that private and confidential. But the reality is that this is about trust and confidence. It's not about the legal advice per se. And there have been lots of examples where governments have been forced to publish that legal advice. I'd just say, publish it, get it out of the way.
That's fascinating. So as you were part of a government that fought having to publish the legal advice over Iraq, but you've changed your mind now, you think just get it out there.
But in the end, we had to publish.
You were dragged into it.
We had to publish because the public had lost trust and confidence in us on Iraq. And this is the situation that we're living in now. Get over it and publish it rather than keep hanging on and dragging back is what I would say. Mark,
what do you say to that? I mean, as a former boss of the civil service, is that like bringing you out in hives, the idea of getting official stuff into the public domain? Or maybe times have changed?
I think we've had examples where legal advice has been forced to be published, either by the courts or by Parliament. I think in this case we shouldn't actually obsess with the process. What is really important is whether it's the full legal advice, whether it's a summary, as David Lammy says, whether it's a minister in Parliament explaining the legal basis for the decisions they're making. Actually, we have to really focus on the substance. We have a rigorous arms export control regime in this country. It's complex, but what it really boils down to is that it is unlawful in British law to export arms that will be used in breach of international law. That's fundamentally what people need to understand, is the government's assessment that they're being used in compliance with or in breach of international law.
And you understand these issues very well. Right now, do you think the government is doing the right thing? Do you think things are being used legally?
I find it very difficult to judge because I don't have all the facts that the government has at their fingertips, which is why it is really important they set it out. They set out the basis on which they're making that judgment. We've seen just in the last few days a group of very distinguished lawyers, including 2 former Supreme Court justices, who've said they believe that legal threshold has been breached. We have an article today from a former Attorney General saying it hasn't. That needs to be clarified. But it isn't just about the legal question. Of course, there is that legal question, and as both the politicians said, if it's unlawful, and the arms sales must stop. Then there's a separate question: is even if it's lawful, is it right to continue these arms sales? Can they be used to exert some kind of leverage over Israel about the way they're conducting this campaign? And David Cameron's remarks about our support being not unconditional, I think, hints that he's thinking in those terms. And those are the kind of questions I'd be asking if I was still doing my old job.
That's fascinating, though. And I'll come to you in a sec, Valerie, but you're saying, as somebody who actually is one of the jobs you now do is being on the board of BAE, one of the big arms company, you're saying maybe the time has come for politicians to take a different decision here.
Well, all of the defence companies in the UK, of course, comply with the law. And in the end, these are decisions for government, whether sales can continue. BAE doesn't actually sell directly to Israel. It's part of a consortium led by an American company. But the key point is that these are policy decisions for government. And so they need to get the legal advice clear, explain it clearly in Parliament, whether publishing the full advice, summary, whatever. But then they also need to explain the policy issue, which is why is it they're taking the position they're taking, and is there any leverage that can be exercised to try and get Israel to conduct this campaign in a way that minimises the humanitarian catastrophe we're seeing.
So perhaps then, Ruby, this sort of legal advice in a way is a bit of a smokescreen for the decisions that they have to take about whether this is the right thing.
Oh, I see, the government have made a decision. They're going to stick on one side or another. This Labour and Tory thing are just mudslinging. I mean, you listen to them and what is it, QP? When they're in...
PMQs, Prime Minister's questions.
I've got dyslexia, but it sounds like animals being slaughtered. Everybody will always stick on their side. If the government decide that, the other government will argue with it. This is just going on and on. I mean, and my brain is scrambled. So what they're leaving the elephant out of the room is if Trump wins, these conversations are obliterated. This guy says he encourages Russia to attack any of the U.S.'s NATO allies whom he considers not to have met their financial. It's about money, right? It's like America's always had to dig deep. They're going out for dinner with these countries, and they're always getting out their wallets.
I mean, this is what
figure it out. This is airtime wasted. What happens if this guy gets in?
Well, this is one of the unpredictable factors in all of this.
Well, then let's worry about it. Let's think about this.
Well, you're one of the people in this country who, you've had an encounter with Donald Trump. You interviewed him.
Yeah, and be very scared, because people are leaving the elephant out of the room on this one. He is a narcissist and a sociopath. If somebody, sorry, can I say that?
You can say that. Other people will have different views, but there you spent time with him. We can see the pictures of you with him.
He knows exactly what he's doing. He's terrifying, and he's igniting fear, and that's what dictators do. So he's working for this class that he's not even part of, the underdog. And this cowboy's going to go in and take everybody down because they're sick of these conversations, the intelligentsia. He just wants to kick some, the rear end. And we don't even know about this. We aren't, our eyes aren't open of what's coming.
Valerie, do you think that's right?
I think whoever gets into the White House at the end of this year, we're going to have to work with them. We're going to have to understand exactly who they are, what they care about. There is an issue, I think, with Donald Trump, which is that he says things to shock. It's not necessarily what he then does. So we will have to do a lot more listening, but also watching in terms of what the actions actually are.
The difference between Israel and Hamas, they're two different breeds. Do you understand? You will never understand Donald Trump. I was on an airplane with him. He scrambled my head. He told me he was going to be the next president of the United States back then, and I laughed. And he said, "Land the plane." I'm in the middle. I'm 33,000 feet, and this guy suddenly decides to dump me. And there's a television camera. He doesn't care. He's a liar. He even lies about golf games. He said he won over Tiger Woods. I know this is irrelevant, but watch out. You're making sense, you think. I didn't understand a word of that, but Trump is another beast.
And you're one of the few people in this country who's had an encounter with him. And Mark, also, you had encounters with him, and maybe we'll touch on that afterwards. But we're going to move on. We're going to talk about Ukraine, and then we'll discuss that again with you after our next interview, because the conflict in Gaza is not the only one. There's no sign of an end to the war in Ukraine on the edge of our continent. Just yesterday, at least 7 people were killed by Russian strikes near the border. The boss of NATO, the Defence Alliance, has been trying to get extra pounds, dollars and euros at a summit this week to help Ukraine keep the fight going on the battlefield. But as he prepares to step down, Jens Stoltenberg told me what's happening in Ukraine is part of a dangerous chain of events around the world, with Russia working with other countries like Iran and China in a new authoritarian alliance. Part of the reason why he believes more cash for Ukraine is vital.
Well, it will be new and extra money, but it will also be a commitment for the long term, because I strongly believe that we need to demonstrate that we are ready to support Ukraine for the long term, and to ensure that we have predictable support to Ukraine and something that ensures the highest possible degree of fair burden sharing among allies.
Are you confident all the NATO countries will sign up to this long-term and expensive plan?
So I'm confident, partly because all allies agree that we should start planning for a stronger NATO role. But second, there's no way to avoid these costs. It has a cost to have Russia as a neighbor. It has a cost to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign independent nation. So what we are discussing is not whether to pay. There's no way to run away from that cost, but how to pay.
Doesn't a 5-year support plan imply the war will go on that long?
Of course, we all hope to end this war as soon as possible. At the same time, we need to be prepared for the long haul, because now President Putin believes that he can win on the battlefield. We need to convey to him that he will not win on the battlefield, that we are ready to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. And the clearer we convey that message in words and in actions, the more likely it is that President Putin realizes they will not win. He has to sit down and negotiate a peace that ensures that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign independent nation. Then when the war ends, then it's important to ensure that it actually stops there, that Russia doesn't attack again. And therefore we need to build a future force. We need to have guarantees in place that Ukraine can defend itself to deter further aggression.
You say Putin must realise he has to negotiate and give up his goals. But it's President Zelensky's current position. He won't cede 1 inch of Ukrainian territory. Perhaps to end the violence and the conflict, Ukraine might have to be willing to negotiate too.
So most wars ends at the negotiating table, but what we know is that what happens around the negotiating table is very closely linked to the situation on the battlefield. So now Russia believes they can achieve their goals on the battlefield by continuing to push militarily against Ukraine. So the way to convince Russia that they have to sit down and accept a solution where Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent, democratic nation in Europe is to give military support to Ukraine. Then, of course, at the end of the day, it has to be Ukraine that decides what kind of compromises they're willing to do. We need to enable them to be in a position where they can actually achieve an acceptable result around the negotiating table.
There's political fatigue in America, and you said recently Donald Trump's remarks suggesting the US wouldn't necessarily protect NATO members who are not spending enough would undermine everyone's security. What's your fear?
I expect that regardless of the outcome of the US elections, the US will remain a loyal NATO ally, because it is in the US security interest to have a strong NATO. The criticism from former President Trump and others in the United States is not primarily against NATO. It is against NATO allies not paying enough for NATO. And that has changed. We expect around 20 allies to spend 2% of GDP on defense. It's a huge difference, and therefore there's fair burden sharing, and that's something which really matters also for the US commitment to NATO.
You're also sounding the alarm about the connections between different conflicts. You name-checked Iran helping Russia, China, North Korea. Do you think we're in a new era of instability?
Yes, and the challenge is that NATO remains a regional alliance. North America and Europe will remain that. But the threats and the challenges we face, they are global. Security is not regional, security is global. And the war in Ukraine demonstrates that very clearly. Russia is receiving support from its friends and partners in Asia. China is propping up the Russian war economy, delivering key parts of the defense industry. And in return, Moscow is mortgaging its future to Beijing. Iran delivers drones and other military equipment to Russia. In return, Russia is delivering technology to the Iranian missile and nuclear programs. The same with North Korea. Enormous amounts, hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition from North Korea to Russia, straight into the conflict or the war against Ukraine. In return, Russia is delivering technology to North Korea. So this is very much the same. What happens in Asia matters for Europe, and what happens in Europe matters for Asia. And that makes it even more important and like-minded countries, NATO allies, but also our partners in the Asia-Pacific, that we also work more closely together. And that's exactly what we do to stand up against this stronger alliance of authoritarian powers.
So you describe a sort of chain of danger, and we see that playing out in Ukraine, we see it playing out in the Middle East. You've condemned the strikes on aid workers in Gaza this week, and you've said what's happening is a humanitarian catastrophe. Do you believe Israel's gone too far?
I strongly believe that it's very important that NATO allies, including the United States, are now conveying a very clear message to Israel that they have to do more, significantly more, to protect civilians, to protect aid workers. And I also welcome the efforts by the United States and United Kingdom and others to facilitate some kind of agreement on the ceasefire to end the human suffering and the humanitarian catastrophe we see unfolding in Gaza.
With all the rising threats, some leaders are starting to encourage countries to consider military service, forms of conscription again. Do you think more countries, maybe even the UK, should think about that?
Well, as Secretary General of NATO, I don't have any recommendations on whether allies should have conscription or not. NATO is asking for specific capabilities, for a number of brigades, for planes and ships manned with qualified personnel. And then how different allies provide these capabilities, these forces, is up to allies themselves to decide. It's whether it's professional or conscripted armed forces. Then, as a former Norwegian Prime Minister, I can say that in Norway we have had conscription also for decades. I served myself back in 1979, and we still have conscription. And actually, when I was Prime Minister, we introduced conscription not only for men but also for women. Because by having conscription, we actually get access to the best and the most qualified, educated part of the young population.
Are you frightened for the future?
We live in a more dangerous world, and we had to be prepared for crisis, conflicts. And it's extremely hard to foresee the unforeseen. Very few people were able to foresee the war in Ukraine, at least in 2014, or the rise of ISIS, or 9/11, or many other crises we have been confronted with. But again, in a more uncertain, in a more dangerous world, it's even more important that we have strong international institutions, and in particular that we have a strong defense alliance, because together, North America and Europe, we are 50% of the world's military might. So as long as we stand together, promise to protect each other, no NATO ally will be attacked, we will be safe.
Secretary General, thank you so much for speaking to us. Well, a sobering message there from the NATO chief, Mark. This new authoritarian alliance, countries coordinating to try to undermine democracies. But also, as we were touching on before, the possibility of Trump back in the White House. What effect would that have on what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, I think, first, let's start with the very last point Jens Stoltenberg made. We have a true alliance. It's half of the world's military might, actually more than that in spending terms. With our Pacific allies, it's 40% of the world economy, a bulk of the world's international aid. So let's not be obsessed by our adversaries. They don't have a real alliance. It's transactional. China is buying Russian oil at bargain basement prices. They aren't really supplying weapons. The Russians are needing to go to Iran and North Korea to get the weapons they need. And it's essentially it's not really an alliance. It's an arrangement of convenience. And as he says, China is actually probably the main beneficiary of it. On Trump, I mean, as we've discussed already, he is unpredictable. I mean, I've dealt with him when he was last president. He is extremely challenging. I think there are some things we know he will do. As Valerie says, he doesn't always do everything he says he'll do, but there are some things we're pretty sure he will do. He'll take America out of the climate change agreements. Will they be able to hold, or will they unravel? There'll be considerably more protectionism, tariffs, non-tariff measures, including against allies. There'll be who knows what within the United States. But also he's already diluted the American security guarantee to allies, not just in Europe, but in the Pacific as well. And the lesson for us is therefore Europe shouldn't just wait on the result of the presidential election, we need to step up ourselves, as Jens Stoltenberg was suggesting, and take more responsibility for our own defence, more responsibility for supporting Ukraine.
And of course Trump might not win, but of course it's a real prospect. Ruby?
Yeah, I think that we're leaving another elephant out of the room, is that we're mentally unstable. I'm sure you have good intentions, but we're living in a country now where almost everything comes down to the mental health of the country. It's 1 in 4. Kids are 1 in 3, because they're living on creating their own brand. So everybody's out of control. So, the people that really run the country are the population. So I wrote a book, if you don't mind me saying, which is out in paperback, called I'm Not As Well As I Thought I Was, which really does take in the fact that I use myself as an example. I have depression. I cannot think straight. It doesn't help that the world is frazzling me. It's not my fault in a way. It's that we really have to deal with this domestic problem first.
So
there's not enough beds. There's not enough psychiatrists. There's not enough anything. And this is getting exasperated. And the news is just coming at us. So there's no airtime. We can't think clearly. We have to find a way of getting out of this fight and flight mode. And this exasperates it. Just give us an answer. Just tell us what's going to happen. It's terrifying what Trump is going to do. Does he have his finger on the button? Is he going to change his mind? We already have enough fear. Couldn't one person just be a spokesman instead of giving us news about what guns are pointed?
So if we are then sort of living in an age of anxiety, Valerie, then how do leaders and politicians actually confront that? What should they do?
So let me pick up on one of Ruby's points first, if I may, which is just this general anxiety that we're seeing across people in the country, and I think across the world. And I see it every day as someone who is working with young people in a university setting. Well-being is a major issue for all of them. It's about the now, but it's also about the future.
Yeah, but how do you deal with it?
They're
Where's
contemplating
the money from the government.
They're contemplating a future that they don't know and understand because it's rapidly changing the whole time.
Sure, but
and Ruby, you're right.
How do you deal with the mental issue that's exasperating everything? And mental is physical.
So everybody wants that security. We want to be able to hang on to things. We want a world that we understand.
That's not mental illness.
It's well-being.
Is total terror.
There's well-being, and as you say, there's mental illness. And how can you get something that feels stable and secure?
Yeah, medicine.
Unfortunately,
the money should go to research into neuroscience. It should go to giving people more beds. They need security. Forget the rest of the world. This is just the outcome of our mental state.
And we will
the madness is all over the world.
And we will talk more.
But Ruby,
I think funding for mental health is something we talked about before.
Part of that is that we have to prepare people for a world of greater instability.
We don't believe you.
We're not going to be able to give them the stability that everybody's looking for.
And Mark, a final word to you. I mean, you were the boss of the civil service, in charge of the civil service at a very difficult time for the country during the pandemic. We know from some of the messages that came out at the COVID inquiry that not everything was very well in government. Do you think that government is fit to cope with the challenges that we've all been talking about this morning?
Government needs to make some big changes in order to make sure it is fit to deal with the challenges in the next 25 years. Ruby's absolutely right to point to this mental health question. It has wider issues. I used to run the Home Office. Many of the people that we dealt with in crime and terrorism and so on had those issues too. Government needs to get itself into the right shape for the future.
Okay, huge challenges all around, but thank you all so much for giving us your insights this morning. It's been great to have you all. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you, of course, to you for joining us, for watching at home. We've talked about all sorts of serious things this morning. We've been trying to get to the bottom of some of the doubts and dangers around the world today. We should remind you that there are elections also coming in this country soon. Local elections, if you're watching in England or Wales, you have at least a vote on a police and crime commissioner, if not your local council too. And the deadline to sign up for that is coming fast on April the 16th. You don't need me to tell you how important it is for you to have your voices heard. However, we have run out of time for today. I'll be on Sunday newscast with Paddy O'Connell later on BBC Sounds. But I will look forward to seeing you next Sunday, same time, same place.
I love the traitors. Private base.